Abraham Lincoln, The Kentucky Years, is provided by the Kentucky Historical Society.
The image of Lincoln today is bigger than life. And maybe that's how it should be for a president who had such an impact on us as a nation. America didn't become America until after Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln himself said at one point to a group of soldiers that he was living proof that any father's child could live in the White House.
The idea that a person could rise from that tiny cabin in Kentucky to the presidency of the United States is not just the American dream, it's a universal dream.
Abraham Lincoln, whose name and face are known the world over, is famed as possibly America's greatest leader. He was a major force in shaping the United States into the nation we know today. But our fascination with him isn't just in the heights he reached, it's in the journey that took him there. All I've got to do is say, born in a log cabin, and immediately you know I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln. All of us feel like we know at least part of his story. We've heard it all our lives. And many places lay claim to him. West of here, the state of Illinois proclaims itself the land of Lincoln. But only this place, near Hodgenville, Kentucky, has the honor of being the birthplace of the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. In the early 1900s, as the centennial of his birth approached, a campaign began to build a memorial at Abraham Lincoln's birthplace. More than 100,000 Americans contributed. And in 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt came to Hodgenville to lay the cornerstone. 2 years later, President Taft was here for the dedication. Nestled into a green Kentucky hillside, it's an impressive sight with its 56 granite steps representing the 56 years of Abraham Lincoln's life. Behind the massive columned facade, visitors come to the heart of the memorial and a tiny log cabin, a symbol of the rough-hewn time and place into which a future president was born. Many have made the pilgrimage to Abraham Lincoln's birthplace, some 200,000 every year. They come and they climb these 56 steps. Who could have ever imagined all this back in 1808, the year Thomas Lincoln bought this land? In those days, it was a frontier farm called Sinking Spring for its year-round source of fresh water that flowed into an underground cavern. The story of Abraham Lincoln's life in Kentucky doesn't really begin at Sinking Spring, of course. Both his parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, came into the state as young children, traveling through the Cumberland Gap with their families in the great westward migration following the American Revolution. Thomas's father, whose name was Abraham, brought his family through the Gap around 1782, eventually settling near present-day Louisville at a place called Long Run. It was there, on a spring day in 1786, that Abraham and his sons, Mordecai, Josiah, and Thomas, met a band of Indians. A shot was fired, and Abraham Lincoln was killed. In the custom of the time, Mordecai, the eldest son, inherited his father's entire estate. As the youngest son, Thomas inherited nothing. Having to make his own way in the world, he eventually moved to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where he made his living as a carpenter and cabinet maker. It was about this time that Thomas began courting a young lady named Nancy Hanks. On June 12, 1806, they were married. The next year, their first child was born, a daughter they named Sarah.
Even though Thomas Lincoln lived in Elizabethtown, was a carpenter, jack of all trades, he really wanted to farm. And so he and Nancy were able to acquire a rather substantial farm, Sinking Spring Farm.
It was at the Sinking Spring Farm that Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to a second child, a son born February 12, 1809. He was named Abraham in honor of his grandfather.
The mythology of Lincoln is that he comes from this hardscrabble frontier family living in this log cabin, very poor. But in reality, the Lincolns were middle class in a frontier setting, and even perhaps above that. Thomas Lincoln, I think, was in the top 20% of the taxpayers in his county. So they were almost upper middle class. Now, when he left Kentucky, they faced harder times. But in Kentucky, his father was well respected and well known.
Despite their success, the Lincolns were forced off the Sinking Spring Farm in 1811 in a dispute over ownership of the land. It was a common problem in Kentucky in those days when property might change hands many times and surveys weren't always reliable. Leaving Sinking Spring, the family rented 30 acres of bottomland along Knob Creek. Abraham was less than 3 years old at the time. So it was Knob Creek Farm that formed his earliest memories of his life in Kentucky. They weren't pioneers, but they lived on the frontier. Explain that.
I think that's an important distinction. Abraham Lincoln's grandfather was most definitely a pioneer. He left everything behind, loaded up a wagon with what goods he could bring through the Cumberland Gap, came through with Daniel Boone and Thomas Walker. They were true pioneers. But by the time Thomas, Abraham Lincoln's father, and his mother, Nancy, lived here, they were living on the frontier. There were other families living in the vicinity, about 9 families in this valley. There was no town of Hodgenville. There was just a mill there at the time. So they were living on the frontier.
Knob Creek has changed very little over the past 200 years. I can just imagine a young Abraham Lincoln working these fields or playing out here right where we're walking.
Right where we're walking. There's been no development here since the Lincoln period. This was the main field, and they grew corn and pumpkins. Abraham would have been responsible for helping his father with planting crops. In fact, that's his first memory of planting pumpkin seeds in between the rows of corn as the corn is being planted.
Even as a young child, Abraham had many day-to-day chores on the farm. Chores like carrying water and tending animals and working in the garden. Life on the frontier, even in good times, wasn't easy. And sometimes it was almost unbearably difficult.
Abraham Lincoln experienced his first taste of death while he was living here at Knob Creek. He had a younger brother, Thomas Jr., that was born and died in infancy. We don't know a lot about that. We don't know even when he was born. We just know it was during the Knob Creek time. The marker's been found, and that's how we know where he was buried.
Abraham himself narrowly escaped death while at Knob Creek. He and a neighbor boy, Austin Gallagher, were crossing the creek when suddenly young Abe slipped and fell into the stream. Neither boy could swim, but Austin quickly pushed a tree branch into the swirling water. Abraham was able to grab hold of it and pull himself to shore. The cabin where Austin Gallagher and his family lived was just down the road from the Lincolns. It was later moved from its original site and now stands at the boyhood home. Frontier life taught young Abraham Lincoln many lessons, but opportunities in the classroom were few and far between. All told, he had less than 2 years of formal education. When he was able to attend school, Abraham, along with his older sister Sarah, walked 2 miles across the hills to what was called an ABC school, or sometimes a blab school, because the lack of writing tools meant lessons had to be recited aloud.
As a boy in Kentucky, he told one of his campaign biographers, when he was learning his letters, that he loved to make the letters. He got fascinated, so if he could find a place to stick to make it in dirt or make it in the snow or the dust on a window or something like that. He would do that. And I just don't think there's any doubt that what we're seeing here is a born writer.
Young Abraham Lincoln also loved to tell a good story, a skill he no doubt learned from his father.
And I think it began way back, really back in Kentucky, when, as it was said, his home there was on the Cumberland Trail, and his father was a great storyteller. And he used to listen to his father as a 7-year-old telling stories, and said he couldn't go to bed at night until he could recapture those stories in words that his little friends in the field would be able to understand. And then he would go out and stand on a tree stump and entertain his friends. Maybe that first indication of the pleasure of having a crowd of people who like you.
The road past the Lincoln's Knob Creek Farm was a well-traveled north-south route that brought him in contact with many people. Among them, groups of slaves being sold south.
He did witness slaves being taken to the market, walking along in a coffle, which is when slaves are chained together and they're being forced to walk. Many times they're being forced to sing, even though they're on their way to a slave market. I think he was affected by that.
Both Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln opposed slavery and were members of an anti-slavery church. Abraham himself would later say that if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. And slavery was one of the reasons the Lincolns left Kentucky, though not the main reason. In 1816, Thomas Lincoln lost his long court battle over the Sinking Spring Farm. A few months later, a claim was made against the owner of the Knob Creek property, and all of the families living there were threatened with eviction. For Thomas Lincoln, that was the last straw. In the fall of 1816, the family loaded their belongings onto wagons and headed across the Ohio River to the then untamed wilderness of Indiana. Abraham Lincoln would never again live in the state of his birth, but his Kentucky years remained part and parcel of the man throughout his life. Holding the nation together through the horror of the Civil War and delivering that first promise that freedom and equality are the birthright of all Americans, those lessons from the Kentucky frontier would never leave him. The Kentucky accent and the unsophisticated ways that led so many to underestimate him. His love of reading and writing, his skill as a storyteller, his determination, his ambition, and his unfailing moral compass. The seeds for them all were sown in the rolling and lush green hills of Kentucky.